my favorite stories in all the Bible. I know what you're thinking. You're thinking, didn't you say last week's was your favorite? Well, it was last week, okay? As we look at this passage of Scripture, it's an incredible story. It's called Living in the Dark. And as we read this story, there's some incredibly significant things in here that I believe, if you'll take them to heart, will change the decisions you make every day. Now, I want you to listen to me for a second before we read this story. As we read this story, what I'm going to do today is I'm going to explain to you the point, the reason of this story. Now, there are other details in this story, like any story. There's a demon-possessed man. That's not necessarily the point. Demon possession is not the point of this story. It is a reality. It is a detail. But the point of this story is living in the dark. So let's read about this one man's experience about living in the dark. Read with me, if you will, the first 20 verses. It says, they came to the other side of the sea, to the country of the Gerasenes. And when Jesus had stepped out of the boat, immediately there met him out of the tombs a man with an unclean spirit. He lived among the tombs, and no one could bind him. All right? No one could bind him anymore. Not even with a chain. For he had often been bound with shackles and chains, but he wrenched the chains apart, and he broke the shackles in pieces. No one had the strength to subdue him. Night and day. Say that with me. Night and day. Among the tombs and on the mountains, he was always crying out and cutting himself with stones. And when he saw Jesus from afar, he ran and he fell down before him at the feet of Jesus. And crying out with a loud voice, he said, what have you to do with me, Jesus, Son of the Most High God? I adjure you by God, do not torment me. For he was saying to him, come out of the man, you unclean spirit. Jesus asked him, what is your name? And he replied, my name is Legion, for we are many. And he begged him earnestly not to send them out of the country. Now a great herd of pigs was feeding on the hillside. And they begged him, saying, send us to the pigs, let us enter them. So he gave them permission. The unclean spirits came out and entered the pigs, and the herd, numbering about 2,000, rushed down the steep bank into the sea, literally the Greek, over the edge, and drowned in the sea. The herdsmen fled and told it in the city and in the country, and the people came to see what it was that had happened. And they came to Jesus and saw the demon-possessed man, the one who had the legion of demons, sitting there, clothed and in his right mind, at the feet of Jesus. They were afraid. It's not what you think for revival, right? And those who had seen it described to them what had happened to the demon-possessed man and to the pigs. And they began to beg Jesus to depart from their region. And as he was getting into the boat, the man who had been possessed with demons begged Jesus that he might be with him. For the first time in our going through Jesus' miracles, Jesus said to him, instead of go and don't tell anyone, he said, Jesus didn't permit him, but he said, go home to your friends. Who's the 4 people you wrote down last week? And tell them how much the Lord has done for you, and how he has had mercy on you. And he went away and began to proclaim in the Decapolis how much Jesus had done for him, and everyone marveled. What you're looking at, the point of the story is this. You're seeing a picture of someone, anyone. It could be your child, it could be your grandchildren, it could be your siblings, your neighbor. The point of this story is you're seeing someone without Jesus. That's the point of this story. They're lost. You know, we were discussing this, and here's what I don't think people understand about being lost. A year and a half or so ago, my sweet daughter, now 13, gave her heart to Jesus and we baptized her. And then there is my brother, Brad Loggins. If you hear his testimony, you will hear a testimony of a man who was trying to destroy anything good in his life and was allowing drugs to do many of the same things in his life and heart that we read about here. And God transformed him. And he's got a tale of all of the wickedness that sin took him to, the depths that it took him to. But I need you to understand and hear me this morning. If you were to take Brad Loggins and stand him here before Christ, and you were to take Nicole Dobbs and stand her here before Christ, and we were able to look into their heart, there is no difference. Amen. She was just as wicked as Brad. See, we have a tendency, when we talk about being saved or lost, to try to look up and evaluate behavior. There are no degrees of lostness. There's spiritual death and spiritual life. But when we look at people, we look at their morality, and because they're good people, our family, our friends, for some reason, we don't see that story in them. But if they don't know Christ, that is them internally, even if it hadn't manifested itself externally yet. And so, I want you to follow me. I want you to look into this story. Check me out. The point of this story is there are no levels of lostness. There's spiritual death and there's spiritual life. You know, and we see there's some things we can learn from this story, and one is the mistakes that we make of the devil and the way that he works in our midst and the way that he operates. One is we just don't give him any peace of mind, and we think he's a figment of our imagination. The other is we exalt the devil. He loves both extremes. Simply, the Bible says, be sober-minded, be watchful for your adversary. The devil prowls around like a roaring lion, seeking someone to devour. What we need to see and understand is the reality of spiritual death. See, death separates. What if one of your loved ones that you wrote on that list last week, if they don't know Jesus, they're separated from God? This is really what's going on in their hearts. So, we first must look at the reality of spiritual condition of those around us. Now, here's what's important. The geography in which this happened. Why is that important as we look at this story? This town was a town where the Jews came. And you think about it and you say, wait a minute. What about all those pigs? You see, strict Jews were not allowed to be around pigs. It was forbidden. But this town was a special place where all the Jews came. And here's what we know about this town. And here's what we know about all the Jews coming to this town. It was the Las Vegas of Jesus' day. See, that's what's so interesting and important about this story. See, it's going to matter that you understand where they were and what was happening. And you know what happens in Vegas, right? What goes on at Vegas stays at Vegas, right? It's going to be important in the end of the story. But this was the Las Vegas of Jesus' day. I find that interesting. Us climbing on bikes and going into places where they tell us Christians aren't supposed to be. Jesus was at Vegas. And here's the spiritual now. You say, preacher, what do you mean? You're talking about this demon-possessed man and all that went on. How do you get that it's about lostness? There are several ways that we're going to look at, but one is Ephesians 2:1. And you were dead in the trespasses and sins. 1 First thing that we find from this story and we learn is this: confrontation is never pretty. You see the turmoil going on here? You know what I know? I know that no matter how lovingly when you confront your loved ones about their lostness, their spiritual death or deadness, confrontation is never pretty. But I want you to see the enemy is exposed here. Here's the reality. The filth of all that we read about. Can you imagine when we read the other stories? This story is in 2 other gospel accounts. It's in 3 of the gospels. What we find is a man in a tomb with dead men's bones, locked up, naked, dried blood. He's cut himself. There's nothing pretty about it. It's filthy. But the truth of the matter is, this filth is the result of all sin. This is the description of the filth that he was driven to. Notice the demonic. Don't lose sight of this. This man was a person. Why is this so heart-wrenching? I want you to think about your own family. You know, as you think about your own family and your own loved ones, we all have a demonic story to tell. Someone close to us, someone we love that has been ravaged by sin, bound in bondage of addiction and despair. And you know, the truth of the matter is, you might be that person in your family story. This may be you particularly. Some of you that are here this morning. Here in verse 16 it says he was demon-possessed, literally demonized. It means he was under the influence of one or more spirits. What does that mean? How does that affect us, Pastor? I want you to look up here for a second. This is a truth I want you to take to your grave. Sin is like a rattlesnake. We can play with it for a while, but eventually it's going to get us. Look what he says there in verses 2 through 5. He says that he came out from the tombs, a man with an unclean spirit. He lived among the tombs, and no one could bind him anymore, not even with chains. For he often had been bound with shackles and chains, but he tore them apart, and he broke the shackles in pieces. No one had the strength to subdue him. Night and day among the tombs and on the mountains, he was always crying out and cutting himself with stones. See, when we think about sin, we think about unclean things. I've had many, many lost people describe themselves, the torment that they experience from the end of their sin, this same way. But I want you to all look up here for a second. Satan never describes sin this way. Because the Bible says, 2 Corinthians 11:14, and no wonder, for even Satan disguises himself as an angel of light. And so it is no surprise if his servants also disguise themselves as servants of righteousness. Their end will correspond to their deeds. This man lived and is living in a cemetery with dead bones, naked, chained, dirty. He's lost his mind. He's dangerous to himself and others. He's been cutting himself. And just like with Vegas and all the sin that goes with that lifestyle, all they want you to see is that it comes with lights and excitement. The media will never show you the product of sin. He is the product of sin. Drug abuse, or whether it's pornography addiction, all of it leads to sleepless nights. Marriage is destroyed. I heard a song this week that Elvis sang that probably describes it very well. In the ghetto. See, in the ghetto is the reality of sin, not the lights and the excitement. Verse 3, he says he lived in tombs. with dead men's bones, imprisoned by chains. No matter what sin road you're on, whether it's soft porn, adultery, fornication, drug abuse, alcoholism, narcotics, this is the only destination you're going to reach. Yeah, there are all kinds of paths out there, but the Bible is very clear there's only one destination for all those many paths. I want you to think through it for a second. The Bible says the townspeople had tried to restrain him, but he'd always broken out. See, that's always the lie with sin, that you can sin in moderation, you can control it. It's not true. No one can control or manipulate sin. You are always controlled by and manipulated by sin. Inside, this man was wretched and miserable. That is the real picture of lostness. Whether it's Brad or Nicole. Brad or Nicole. A spiritual x-ray reveals the same thing on a lost person. Any lost person. Yes, you see that in Brad's life, he had lived longer and made more decisions based upon his lostness. It had come to the outside. But if Nicole had stayed lost, it would have eventually came to the outside of her too by behavior. But there are no levels. So you look at this man, you know, it's something we don't like to stop and gaze at, right? I've noticed that lost people don't like to talk about chains. Don't like to talk about the consequences of sin. But I've noticed that Christians don't either. I've noticed we're pretty silent on the subject also. We don't like real life situations. It's more truth than we really want to have to deal with. We'd rather cover it up. It helps in our denial of sin. It helps in our denial that our loved ones are really in this spiritual condition. But I need you to understand something. If your loved ones don't know Jesus, they're really in this spiritual condition. There's no hell number one. There's no hell number two. There's no level of lostness. 1, 2, 3, or 4. This is the inside of every dead spiritual person. But this man, he was naked, he was ill, bleeding with cuts, scars, he was infected, he was delirious with pain. And this masochistic pleasure. That's the way sin works. That's the reality of sin. He was repulsive. He was unwelcome and unloved. No one wanted to love him. You know, here's the truth. Not everyone's sin has reached this point. Not everyone looks on the outside this way, but all sinners look on the inside this way. As we look at this spiritual x-ray, if you will, there are even spiritual leaders that look this way on the inside. First thing that you need to know is this. You can't blame the devil for your sin. James 1:14, each person is tempted when he is lured and enticed by his own desire. It's kind of like the little girl and her brother who had this knockdown, drag-out fight. Her mother came in and got her off of her brother. And her mother said, listen, why did you let the devil put into your heart to pull your brother's hair and kick him in the shins? She said, well, you know, the hair thing was the devil's, but the shins was all mine. Probably one of the greatest sins in the church is our spiritual denial of lostness in its reality, its darkness. I realize it'd be hard for me to put my 4 children up here, as much as I love them, and look at the outside and realize that this is the inside of the ones that don't know Christ, but this is the inside. The truth is, we're able and capable of being evil all on our own. But this is where the sin road takes us, right there. Do you understand why Spirit-filled preachers stand and preach against sin? Because the real battle is being waged right now between God and Satan for your souls. And we cannot minimize that reality. I hear so many spineless, yellow-bellied preachers that want to tell you all the time that God accepts you where you are. And what they mean is you can stay where you are and you'll be all right with God if your behavior fits into this box. I need you to understand, God does accept you where you are, but He never leaves you where you are. Amen. Grace is not that you can get away with sin. Grace is that God brings you out of sin. Amen. Because sin always brings death. This is the picture of reality. So the real battle is waging here. You know what first century Christian Tertullian said? He said, as you look at this demon-possessed man and you look at all of this going on, what you have to understand is Jesus came. We were made in the image of God. And in the Garden of Eden, sin entered in and began to decay and destroy that. Jesus came to restore the image of God in us. This is a beautiful picture. You see, what does it mean to restore the image of God in man? It is the glory of God that a man is fully alive. See, Satan's battle plan is to distort, destroy the divine image of God in us. When we look at those out there living in sin, in habitual lifestyles of sin, is that the image of God in man? No, it's this image, the image of the death of man. You look at this demonic, the misery. Can you imagine living in that cave with rotting flesh? Your own human waste, naked, chained, bleeding. That's what sin really produces. When you read about this man, and you see the reality of his chains and his filth, you don't see the glitz and the glamour of the Jersey shores here. And you don't see God's plan for us in the Garden of Eden. Do you know how many people have said to me, preacher, tell them the truth about sin? Because it almost destroyed me, preacher. Warn them, preacher. Don't be foolish this morning. Don't be foolish and think you can walk one of these paths and not end up in destruction. Notice verse 9, it says legion. Roman legion consisted of 6,000 foot soldiers. This old boy was under the power of literally thousands. And no matter how strong you think you are, you won't be able to control sin either. Second thing is, real freedom comes from surrender. I want everybody to look up here. Everybody make eye contact with me. Look up here. Every Sunday, I call for you to surrender to Jesus. And I need you to understand, when I'm calling for you to surrender to Jesus, there is no other way that you can be saved. Saying a prayer didn't do it. Coming and surrendering all that you are, right here it is. Some of you have been told, why would I do that? That would only put me into bondage to Jesus. You're not surrendering to bondage. Your sin, that's the bondage. Right. You're surrendering to the love of God. Amen. Yes. That's what you're surrendering to. That's why we sing the song of Chain Breaker. He doesn't give you chains, He breaks them. Amen. Hallelujah. Man, Every time you're called to surrender to Jesus, it's a call to surrender to the love of Jesus Christ. And I need you to understand something. There are only really, in our lives, as we look at real freedom, there are only really 3 categories of bondage. And every one of us were or are in these, are bound. Pride, greed, and lust. Pride, you say, not me. You got the first one. It only goes downhill after that. And to be free, you've got to surrender all 3 of those areas to Jesus. The places that the devil tells us that we find freedom in is really where you lose it. It's really where you lose your freedom. Not find it. I need you to think about this man. He was a real man with a real family, a real future. And what we see here is the power of Christ. Notice that Jesus spoke. And as he spoke, when this, you see literally salvation released. This man is literally released from Satan. As you look at this story, there are 2 reasons that the pigs were destroyed. Okay? Number 1, the demons didn't want to be cast into the abyss. Where's the abyss? That is the demons that are chained up in hell, waiting the final judgment to be thrown into the lake of fire. They didn't want to go there. Second reason that Jesus destroyed these swine, or these swine were destroyed, Jesus didn't destroy them, the demons did. But the second reason they were destroyed, it was the livelihood of this community. And so the demons thought one last poke at the Son of God. When they all 2,000 went over the hill, it had been like taking your 401k and throwing out the window when you rode up and down 85. And they did that in order maybe that they might kill Jesus. But I need you to see the plan of Christ. As you look here, the thing that you see was this man, this tormented man. And that day, no one could deny the power of God. Jesus showed the demons and sin there is an end to you. Not reformation, but resurrection. Transformation. You see, if you're in the bondage of sin, you don't need to do better. You don't need to clean up. Because you're just like this demonic in a tomb of dead men's bones. Religion is yet but another chain. You don't need reform to learn new behavior. You need to be resurrected because you're dead. And I need y'all to think about that for a second. Those people that you wrote down last week on your list. See, I love, that's why I love last week's story and I love this week's story. If you don't get those 4 people to Jesus, they're dead. They don't have another hope. And them doing better, remember, here's Brad and all of his bad behavior. Here's my daughter who hadn't had it, but on the inside they were equally wicked and dead. We don't like to really talk about what lostness means. If we did, there would not be one empty seat in this building. But your friends and family, if you don't intervene, if you don't take the opportunity, they will be forever in this condition, separated from God. Do you see that this man was on the outskirts of town? That's what sin does. But it was also a picture of hell. And if you're here this morning and you don't know Jesus, that is where you're going. You cannot change it yourself. You must surrender to the love of Jesus. But when you do, did you see that Jesus changed him from the inside all the way to the outside? I love this. Jesus instantly restored God's image in this man. Look at verses 11 through 13. Read it with me. This is incredible. There in 11, it says, Now a great herd of pigs was feeding there on the hillside, and they begged him, saying, Send us to the pigs. Let us enter them. And so he gave them permission, and the unclean spirits came out and entered the pigs, and the herd, numbering about 2,000, rushed down the steep bank into the sea, drowned in the sea. The herdmen fled and told it in the city and in the county, and the people came to see what it was that happened. And verse 15, they came to Jesus, and they saw the demon-possessed man, the one who had had the legion, sitting there, clothed, and in his right mind. I don't know about you, but that's incredible. People always ask, well, preacher, why did Jesus, why in the world did he let all those pigs die? Because we think, you know how Jews were about pigs. We think it was the Jews that owned those pigs. You understand? They were religious. They were forbidden to be around the unclean animals. They couldn't go in the temple. They couldn't worship God. And what Jesus was showing that he is master of over all. They were compromising Jews. Luke says he was formerly naked, and he now sits at the feet of Jesus clothed. Do you know what that means? He hadn't worn clothes in a long time. The image of God was being restored. Who in your list needs the image of God restored? As he sat at the feet of Jesus. See, that's why you've got to get those people on your list to the feet of Jesus. Them correcting their behavior, them behaving better. It's not going to happen unless you get them to his feet. Maybe you're the one here this morning that's wretched. Maybe you're living a loathsome existence. Maybe you're living in this misery. I have one question. Whose feet are you sitting at? This man was so far from God, so deep in sin, so many scars. If he can be made well, you can be made well. You say, Pastor, you can't make those claims. How dare you? You don't know. There's no depth that Jesus can't or won't go to restore you. That's right. Amen. Think about it. This was literally the Las Vegas of their day. Jesus went into the Las Vegas, went into the tombs, where he was forbidden to go, and out of there he brought life and restored this man's life. He'll go into the tombs for you too. It just doesn't matter where you are or what condition you're in. This last part is for the church. We have this misconception that when Jesus shows up at church and when the Spirit is moving, everything will be good and everybody will be happy. That's because you don't read the Bible very much. That's why you have those expectations. Jesus showed up in the most sinful part of town. In the Las Vegas of that era. There couldn't be a more wicked place. So number 3, seizing the opportunity in front of you. There was undeniable change in this man's heart. There was no doubt that Satan's chains were broken. And we would have imagined when God begins to move with grace, everything will be great. What did they do? They asked Jesus to leave town. It's kind of like the woman at the well. Right? We imagine when Jesus shows up on the scene and revival breaks out, that everything will be good. But they knew that change would be required. Yep. A lot of churches don't want Jesus. Because when He shows up, real change is required. And if they changed what they were doing in their Jewish Vegas, it meant money loss. They preferred the business people to Jesus. They preferred the pigs to the souls. There are a lot of Baptist churches that do the same. When Jesus comes, it might not be the excitement and the peace that you think. It may stir up more trouble than you ever imagined or even want to deal with when Jesus really comes to town. People are okay with religion. But when Jesus shows up, they either love Him or hate Him. It's always been the same. But don't miss the opportunity. Don't miss it. We can't be like them. It's the same in our family. Jesus shows up. Jesus said, I didn't come to bring peace, but a sword. But for those of you that are in bondage, you need to do just what this demon-possessed man did. He ran to Jesus. And here's what I love. Afterward, at the end of it, he comes and he says, Jesus, take me with you in the boat. Jesus said, no. Go and tell. I want you to look up here for a second, all of you. If you've truly been saved, there's been a time in your life that you realized you were as wicked on the inside as that demon-possessed man. If you've never come to that realization, you've never been saved. No, my daughter's behavior had not equaled that of Brad's, but she was just as lost and wicked and dark. Yep. If you've never come to that realization, you've never been saved. Remember, Jesus didn't come for those that are well, right? The point of that is, until you realize that, I don't care if you're 70, 75, 80, I don't care. I don't care if your mother took you to church and Sunday school, you've been faithful all those years. Have you ever come to the point that you realize you're that dark, that wicked on the inside? My daughter wasn't out doing the things that Brad was doing, but she was spiritually dead just the same. What's incredible, though, is what we see here is Jesus. This man had an incredible story to tell about Jesus' compassion and power over nature, over sin, over the supernatural, and over death. We're never going to win this nation, or this state, or this community, and you'll never win your loved ones to the Lord until you realize their need and your responsibility. That's right. You have a responsibility that you're going to stand before God Almighty one day and have to answer for. You see, when I told you that story about how they cared more about the pigs than they did the demonic, the person, secretly on the inside, you thought how terrible and disgusting was this group of Jews. But be careful. Be careful. You've got a responsibility to the lost. You. And if you don't sense that responsibility and do something about that responsibility, you're no worse than a bunch of hypocrite Jews in Las Vegas. But if you do take it seriously, we can win this nation, this state, and this county, and this community. When you do take it seriously, you realize we nailed him to a tree. He went in the grave, conquered death, for us anyway. And He's willing to come into whatever tomb you're in and do the same. I want to leave you with this truth. See, here's the truth of being born spiritually again. This is the thought I want you to go home with. Here was this demon-possessed man. He was naked. You read all three accounts of the gospel. Naked and chained, laying at his own waste, with rotting bodies, tormented. He cut himself. But when Jesus came that day, this man was cleaned up on the inside. And when Jesus left, he was clean on the outside. And that day, some little boy and some little girl's dad came home, clothed and in his right mind. Would you bow your heads?